Dear Stefan, I'm very happy that we are continuing our conversations in 2024. And this time we're going to start with traditional Mongol sports. Mongol society was a very martial society, very patriarchal society, warlike society. And because of the ideal of masculinity, they were capable of growing a vast territory of known world. So these things were correlated. And what were the most popular Mongol sports at that time?
Well, they kind of stayed the same, but they, like you said, when the Mongol Empire was first starting, it was a very, very martial society, and they didn't really have time for pastimes per se. So sports was something that was mixed into the necessities of life and the necessary activities of life. So there were two sports that everyone noticed the Mongols kind of grew up on, and one was hunting, of course, and the other was archery. So just at a target, um, standing archery or riding archery at targets. But both of these are essentially the same thing. They're practicing for warfare, and they're practicing their hunting skills to gain food supplies. So these are sports. They seem to think they're fun. They seem to enjoy these activities. Even the Khans will do them in their free time, but these are really things that developed out of necessity in a way on the steppe. These are activities that gave Mongols extra ability to survive in that environment. So hunting, this was Chinggis Khan's favorite sport. And as for shooting, a good archer was so praised that there's a stela, a stone stela in Mongolia, written in the Mongolian script. And it's a unique early Mongol Empire writing. And it's just to commemorate an archer who shot an arrow at an unprecedented distance. Basically, he set a world record in archery. So that's what the stone is for. And it goes to show you. And that stone's important now for linguists in reconstructing the Middle Mongol language, Mongolian language. But it shows you really, it highlights what their favorite sports were at the start of the empire: hunting and archery.
Was falconry a popular sport?
Yeah, it was. And falconing fits into the sort of larger umbrella of hunting. It was part of it. But maybe falconing was a little bit more for the privileged. We have a great line from Chinggis Khan. It's recorded. He's with his close friend and generals, and he asked them, "What's the greatest joy in life?" He asked about three of these individuals, and they all say, "Oh, falconing." So they specifically say falconing is the best, like it's the best form of hunting. Yep. And then Chinggis Khan surprises them all by saying that very famous line. He says, "No, the greatest joy in life is to destroy your enemies, steal their horses, and ride them, and drive their women before you and see their tears, and then of course embrace their wives and daughters or something." And this line was immortalized because the movie Conan the Barbarian stole it, and had Arnold Schwarzenegger's Conan the Barbarian say it as his greatest joy in life. And of course, people just loved it. But that line was actually stolen from the mouth of Chinggis Khan. And another little embarrassing detail about that story was that Chinggis Khan didn't actually say something rough like, "and embrace their wives and daughters." He said, "and kiss their ruby lips," and nice. Dress them up in nice clothes. He says something actually kind of weird. But the main point, we shouldn't get misdirected from it. The main point is that these generals who are thinking, what does Chinggis Khan want me to say? Or they're like, well, of course, the greatest joy in life is falconing. So yes, but I think falconing was a bit of not everyone had a falcon. It
True.
was a bit of an elite form of hunting.
Yeah, it's an expensive sport. Falconry.
Yeah.
It's pretty expensive sport, and actually, it was maybe more popular in Arab world amongst the Arab Muslim elites. If you're talking about the medieval period, until now, it's a quite a popular sport.
Yes. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, who was around at this time, he was a great falconer himself. He wrote a book about falconing, but he was based in Sicily often, which had a lot of Arabs around him. He spoke Arabic. He was influenced by these Middle Eastern and North African.
The Arabic culture, yes.
Right, and he was unusual in that regard, how much he knew about that culture. His astrologer was a Arab, maybe a Sicilian Arab even.
Yeah.
But so I don't know how he may have been unusually for a European monarch. He was unusually interested in falconry. And actually, when the Mongols' envoys came to him and demanded his submission in 1238, they demanded Frederick II submit to the Great Khan. He said, well, I know a lot about falconing. Maybe I can be the Khan's falconer. So Frederick II was a bit of a joker and a devilish character. So apparently, I actually believe that story, but it almost seems like a legend or something. But it was recorded by
he was an extraordinary ruler in his age. He was a kind of erudite and very educated. Not only for his age, in general, he was a person who spoke different languages and knew different traditions.
Yeah, he was called in Latin stupor mundi, like the wonder of the world. And so there was his little contact with the Mongols back in 1238 on falconry. But getting back to Mongol sports, yes, falconry was one of the forms of hunting, but another form of hunting they had was a great group hunt. So where I think even thousands of troops would be involved, and they would drive animals before them on the plains for like many kilometers, maybe hundreds of kilometers, and they'd gradually encircle them with this sort of military maneuver until they'd finally totally circled the animals and they closed in on them. And so you had this huge number of antelopes and what have you, wolves and every kind of animal trapped, and they'd be pulled tighter and tighter into the circle. And then if the Khan was present, like Ogedei Khan, he would have the honor of being the first to ride in and start shooting. And when he'd have enough, he would signal to the others with his kind of hand. He's like, I've had enough. And then they would all ride in from all corners and shooting. But this wasn't just for hunting and meat. This was also practicing military tactics.
Yeah, it was
because this required intense.
It was a part of a military drill.
Yeah. The Europeans who observe the Mongols just say plainly the way they learn warfare is by hunting. That's just practice for warfare. They just move on from hunting animals to hunting people, and but they use the same tactics, the same nerga, as they call it, the hunting net, like the encirclement maneuver. They would practice that even when they invaded Europe. They were using these sort of great encirclement, sort of like the German invasion of the Soviet Union, where they did these massive encirclement movements in the early stages.
Yeah, they were quite successful in the first stage of the war.
Yes. They would capture huge numbers of Soviets. So the Mongols would do that too, but they didn't really take prisoners. So
what we know about Ogedei and his brothers, and how their relations affected the dynastic policies?
Well, so Ogedei he had three brothers. So Jochi is the eldest,
Yeah.
and then there's Chagatai, and then there's Ogedei, and then there's Tolui, and the youngest, Tolui. And they're all sons of Berta, the chief wife of Chinggis Khan. And so Chinggis Khan seems to have had other children, judging by the DNA records that we have now that show some kind of common ancestor for a huge amount of people. So maybe well, I know he had other sons and daughters, but these four sons by Berta had this special position. They were the crown princes. One of them was going to be picked to be Chinggis Khan's successor, and it wasn't sure who it would be. There was the eldest Jochi. He seems to have been kind of, at first, he's controversial because it was not certain if he was actually Chinggis Khan's son or not. There was a rumor that he was actually a bastard son of Berta's kidnapper, a Merkid, some rival tribe in the early days before Chinggis Khan was Khan, captured Berta, and then Chinggis Khan managed to rescue her with the help of Wong Khan, of the Karat people. But when he got her back, she had a child shortly after. So there was this rumor that it was actually the Merkid kidnapper who'd impregnated her. So, and it doesn't help that Jochi's name seems to mean guest. So that almost, sounds like he's not really Chinggis Khan's son. Some people wonder about that name. But he was treated well. And in early Chinese sources, where they have a term that indicates heir apparent, I've seen Jochi be referred to as the heir apparent up until about 1223. And then something bad happened, some kind of controversy happened. And anyway, Jochi died before Chinggis Khan in 1227 at the latest. So he couldn't have been the successor anyway. But Jochi was sort of one of those eldest sons who maybe he thought he was going to become the next Khan, and then he was passed over. And next you have Chagatai, who was a very stern, harsh guy, the second son. He was famous amongst the Muslims. He was known to be a bit of a tyrant, a cruel figure. That's how a lot of them remember him, as he hated the Muslims, but he ruled over them. Chinggis Khan put him in charge of these Silk Road cities full of Muslims, but Chagatai did not like them and did not like the religion. And so they kind of lived in terror of him. And he was very obsessed with the law handed down by Chinggis Khan, specifically the Yasa, the sort of rule book for how this Mongol Empire is going to function. And Chagatai was always, very legalistic, one of these kind of characters. No fun, never smiled. And then you have the third son, Ogedei, who ultimately does become the great Khan. And he's kind of a different character. He's friendly, he's approachable, he's a likable guy, forgiving of people's errors. There's a story that, speaking of sports, that Chagatai and Ogedei had a horse race when Ogedei was Khan, and Chagatai was winning the race. He won the race, and then the next day he said it was a dishonorable crime for me to win the race against the Khan. I should be punished. And Ogedei said, "No, forget about it. I don't care." And he's like, and Chagatai keeps saying, "No, I should be punished. I deserve to die." And according to the law, and Ogedei is just like, "What's wrong with this guy?" Like, so Ogedei was a more conciliatory
more
guy.
Relaxed.
Yeah, he was relaxed, and I think Chinggis Khan picked Ogedei because of that. Chagatai and Jochi would fight. Chagatai called Jochi a bastard in front of people, and that ruined their relationship. They could never be together ever again.
They would create
Chinggis Khan had to send Jochi. Yeah, it would have, and Chinggis Khan was worried about that. So he's like, neither one of these guys can be Khan, probably, because it will just end the same way as many steppe empires when the founder dies. just breaks apart into fragments and civil war.
But this is what happened with Attila the Hun and his empire.
Yeah, it was all about, it was him, and when he was gone, so the empire crumbled. So I think maybe Chinggis Khan, I don't know how much history he knew, but he was a smart guy, and he did have a lot of educated literati officials around him, and maybe they told him about the history of steppe empires, and he would have said, oh, and maybe he just knew anyway from folklore and tales passed down.
Yeah.
He knew how unstable these empires on the steppe are. So he chose Ogedei to be his successor. And then he died in the summer of 1227, and Ogedei took over in 1229. So interestingly, you see all these family dynamics. You know, these guys were conquering the world, but you still have these sibling rivalries. You have treachery. You have personality conflicts, personality differences. But Ogedei managed to get along really well with his youngest brother, Tolui. This seems to be a really close, reliable relationship. Like he seems to have trusted him. And yet, Tolui, who was kind of a war hero, he's winning this war against the Jin dynasty in the early 1230s, and then he suddenly dies in very bizarre, an unnatural death. And some people said he died of an illness, and others said he drank some potion to save his brother's life, who was sick, and others say he just drank himself to death with alcohol.
Yeah, because he died at the age of 54. He wasn't very old, but also he wasn't very young for medieval lifespan.
Yeah, well, Ogedei was also a heavy drinker. So Tolui died younger, and Ogedei was also a heavy drinker, and he died in his 50s, like you said. And no one, he had Persian doctors. He had Islamic physicians who said alcohol is going to kill this guy. We might think that people back then didn't know that, but no, there were many physicians who thought Ogedei was dying of excessive drinking, and they tried to stop him, but he reigned from 1229 to 1241, and he died after a night of carousing and drinking. Yeah, and during the later years of his reign, he had many severe illnesses. So he was getting progressively worse as his time was going on. And he'd make a lot of bad decisions. You know, he'd receive a bow and arrow from some stranger who comes to visit his court, and he'd order the guy to be given basically the equivalent of $500,000, you know, because Ogedei was in his cups by that point, and he says, give this guy $1 million for this bow and arrow. So there's stories like that. And so he was a fairly successful Khan, and he got along with people, but he did have that progressively worsening problem that probably was destabilizing the Mongol Empire.
Actually, he died during the first Mongol campaign in Europe. We're talking about 1241, and other aristocrats, other princes took over, and they continued with the conquest.
Yes. Some people, as you know, a lot of people have argued through the generations that Ogedei's death was lucky for Europe because some even say it saved Europe, because the messengers apparently came to Hungary and announced the death of the Khan, and then Batu pulled out as a result. Personally, I don't know if they could have reached Europe. I don't know if messengers could have gone from Mongolia to Europe by the time the Mongols were pulling back. I think it might be just a coincidence, but either way, the death of Ogedei certainly saved Europe in the sense that it prevented a quick return of Batu. And it caused a lot of political instability.
Actually, they continued relatively successfully, because during his reign, they managed to conquer Georgia and Armenia, and they moved to Korea, and in Europe they managed to capture Kiev.
Yeah, the campaign of Batu from 1235 to 1242
Yeah.
was one of the most successful campaigns in history, probably in terms of land area taken and occupied.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they pulled out of Hungary and Poland and Bulgaria and Serbia. They just completely pulled out of continental Europe and went back to the Dnieper River and made that their kind of front line.
Why they moved to Dnieper River? What was the reason for that maneuver? I mean, we can speculate.
According to William of Rubric, who has his biases, he was a French Belgian ambassador of the King of France. He went to Mongolia. He thought they were in a defensive posture, and sort of they were expecting an attack to come from Europe. So being on the banks of the Dnieper offered a kind of defensive barrier from attacks coming from the west. It seems hard to believe that the West would do that, or be even capable of that attack. But they seem to have decided, well, it looks like if someone puts themselves against a major river, it's usually kind of a defensive posture. So they were using it in that way, I think. But also, they have these herds of animals, huge herds of animals, and so they want to be close to these major rivers. It's to supply them. That's for Mongols, that's the best real estate in the world, to be on a big open grassland like the Pontic steppe and beside a huge river. But Batu himself was not on the Dnieper or the Don. He was east of there on the Volga, which they consider the best river.
Yeah.
And the best grassland. So that's what he got. And so he was on the western bank of the Volga, and his son Sartak and successor Sartak was on the eastern bank. So that was in the whole Golden Horde, that was the best land.
Okay. If you want, I can send you the new link, or maybe you can add something about Ogedei in last 4.5 minutes.
Okay, well, what I would like to talk about in the next section, if you're interested, is the idea of the tombs of the Khans and Ogedei particularly, like where these guys are buried and things like that.
We can talk about their graves and the funerary customs of Mongols that are totally different from funerary rituals of monotheistic religions. We are talking, of course, some of them were Muslims, some of them were also Christians. We spoke about the flexibility of Mongol rulers and relative religious tolerance for the medieval standards. So they didn't stick to one religion as a ruling class. It was in a way similar to some other states founded by nomads or steppe people, when, for instance, ruling class adopted Judaism, but at the same time they tolerated Christianity, paganism, and Islam amongst their subjects. So yeah, we can talk about places where Mongol Khans were buried. I'm going to send you the link in a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. what were the burial customs of Mongols? How they buried their aristocracy, princesses, and rulers? We know that some of them were Muslims, like Tamerlane, who was going to become a very prominent military leader in 14th century, early 15th century. But what happened with other Mongol rulers and military commanders?
Yes, so once they became Muslim, they would have a burial much like another Muslim ruler, and you'll see a grave of a Mongol prince that can look a lot like any other Islamic ruler from that time. But the ones before any conversion to Islam had a totally different custom. They wouldn't be buried, they wouldn't be put in a grave in a sort of mausoleum building. Instead, what would happen was, and this must have been an ancient tradition of the nomads, was that this person would be taken and placed in a tent, and the tent would be buried underground. And then horses would trample, intentionally, they would make horses trample that ground to hide the burial place out in the open field. And it was highly secretive. And the reason's quite simple. These figures would be buried with silk and fine clothing. And this on the steppe was a really desired commodity. They couldn't really make their own fabric.
Yeah.
They could use furs and whatnot, but for and animal products, but for like actual fabric like silk, they had to get it from China, or places like Europe could trade indirectly and give them fabric of in the Golden Horde, for instance. But the point is, so a Mongol noble being buried with silk and everything, people would want to, of course, loot this grave and get all, not just the gold and other valuables, but take the silk too. And that was so one primary source says Mongols are especially afraid of the person's clothing being stolen. And this is why these burials are so secret. But there's some kind of contradictory phrases in the different sources that don't let me or anyone come to a perfectly neat, tidy conclusion about Mongol burials, because on one hand, they bury the person in the plain and try and hide the burial site. But on the other hand, it says that sources often say that they will have a sacrifice of a horse at the site of the burial and then put the stuffed horse's skin onto some poles and put the horse on top of the grave so that it marks the grave. And then I thought, well, how are you hiding it then if you have this this stuffed horse held up on wooden pitchforks in the middle of a plain? Aren't people going to know the guy's buried there? So I don't know, like, because the primary sources don't explain this carefully enough, maybe that wooden horse thing, the stuffed horse, was placed some distance away from the burial spot to try and hide it. I don't know what was going on. But if they put that thing on top of the burial, you think it would give away where the gravesite is. Another thing that Mongol nobles did when they were buried was there was human sacrifice accompanying the burial of a great noble. So his closest servants would be sacrificed with him. They'd be put underground with him. So when this guy dies, his closest servants go into the pit with him and are buried alive. And I think anthropologically, there's a reason they did this that isn't totally just some based on a belief system. I think there's a pragmatic reason, but this is just my own strange theory. But I'll tell you, I think these servants kind of knew too much. And so when a great leader like that dies, they kind of don't want this person around who might have connection. Like they have some kind of complex relationship to the power structure. They know so much, they know so many secrets that it may have been just deemed pragmatic to get rid of the persons that this noble figure was telling all his secrets to about everyone. But that's just a theory. But either way, this was their custom. They had human sacrifice, and the Islamic historians proudly tell us in the Ilkhanate, the Middle Eastern Mongol Khanate,
Yeah.
that the very last Khan to ever have this human sacrifice was Hulagu, and it stopped after him. And he died in 1265 and was buried with servants as sacrifices. And they're quite proud that they stopped that custom, because to the Islamic local population, that would have seemed like a pretty barbaric pagan custom to bury people alive with the Khan. So even though the Khans of the Ilkhanate didn't convert to Islam, or if they did in a very superficial way, until Ghazan Khan converted in 1295, even though for another 30 years between Hulagu and Ghazan, there were pagan Khans, they didn't do that human sacrifice ritual anymore, because apparently it was just too offensive to the local people. So to accommodate them, or maybe because they'd been slightly influenced by Islamic thinking and their advisors, they stopped doing that. But in Mongolia, it was still the custom to be buried with human sacrifices, their closest servants. And they were marked with some kind of tattoo to make sure that they were, when they were chosen for this human sacrifice.
Sacrifice, yes.
Yeah, they were marked so that they couldn't say, no, he never said that. He didn't say that about me. They had some kind of.
How many people they would sacrifice?
I'm not sure, but just a handful, not too many. It wasn't like although Marco Polo tells us that there was a kind of slaughter of Chinese people after Mongol Khan died in China, as they took his funeral carriage back to Mongolia. They were just killing bypassers on the road. Might be true, might not be, but you know, if they did do that, it was probably because of the rage that Mongol Khan had died besieging a fortress in China, in Song China, and in a way the Mongols.
Some kind of reprisal.
Yeah, so I don't think we can put that event under the normal burial customs of Mongols, or funeral customs. But there's a sacred place where they say that Chinggis Khan and his family are buried. In the Chinese official record of the Mongol Empire, the Yuanxi, it says that they take these deceased people, these deceased royals, to this sacred kind of mountain, but it's not that tall of a mountain, called Burkhan Khaldun. And that's where Chinggis Khan grew up, the area of this mountain by the Onan River. And that hill was sacred to him. And so he was buried there. His body was taken there after he died in Tangut territory. And that set the precedent. That became the sort of royal burial sanctuary. So Mongol Khan was for sure buried there. Some other of his Tului was buried there. Kublai Khan wasn't apparently buried there, according to Rashid ad-Din.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Ogedei was not buried there. He was buried in his own. Well, I should explain. The Chinese sources say Ogedei was buried at Burkhan Khaldun, but Rashid ad-Din says Ogedei was buried in his own yurt, his own Hordu or Ordu, which was the Naiman territory, sort of the area of the Altai Mountains, stretching down to the Lake Alakul in Kazakhstan, the Ili River, Emil River. And that's the area of the heartland of the Ogedeians. And for some reason, Ogedei did not choose to be buried in the same place as his father, and many other khans and princesses and what have you were buried there. He chose to be buried somewhere else. And his family seems to have followed that tradition if you read Rashid ad-Din.
Do we know where he was buried exactly? Yeah.
There's a little clue, or not, let's not say a little clue, there's a big clue. It says he was buried at the base of some great mountain. And it was not too far from the Irtish River. So actually, you can narrow this down to some. Maybe I'm saying too much here, but
Yeah.
there's a yeah, there's a lot of big mountains in that area because it's the Altai Mountains. But you got to think, if this is Ogedei Khan and his family, they're going to pick one of the really big mountains in that area. And so you just it's a kind of a process of elimination. It could be in Mongolia, it could be that Tavan Bogt mountain, or it could be some mountain deeper into the farther west. But the tallest mountain in Mongolia is this Tavan Bogt, and it's very spectacular looking. And it wouldn't be totally surprising if Ogedei were and his family had chosen to be buried there. But they seem to be outliers. They I don't know why they didn't choose to be buried in Burkhan Khaldun area, but they did not choose that apparently. But generally speaking, Chinggis Khan and many of his family are in this sacred sanctuary. And of course, if an archaeologist could dig him up and find this grave, we'd have to first of all be respectful of the wishes and the thoughts of the actual Mongolians. But if someone did find that, it would be like the finding of King Tut or um, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi's terracotta army. It would be like one of those archaeological discoveries that comes along every half century. If one of these Mongol Khans could be found, be it a Jachi or Batu in the Golden Horde, I don't know where you'd look for them.
Yeah.
Probably the Volga River, I would guess, the banks of the Volga. Or if you could find Chagatai or especially Chinggis Khan, I mean, this would be the find of a century, and it would tell us a lot about the empire. So, but it seems that in Mongolia, he's not just an interesting historical figure. He's the founder of the nation. He's an almost religious idea, and so I think there's a discomfort and an unwillingness to disturb his burial place. So even if it could be found with like satellite imagery or something, I don't think the Mongolian government would actually allow anyone to go digging around. But despite that, it doesn't stop people from going on the hunt for Chinggis Khan's grave, because it would be one of the greatest finds.
Is it part of hunting for Genghis Khan gold and treasure, like in many cases of the world, where amateur archaeologists and gold diggers are hunting coins and artifacts, or it's something else?
Even if you didn't find his grave, just going around that area of Burkhan Khaldun with a kind of archaeological survey, you might find something amazing. You might find amazing things, because there's more people buried there than Chinggis Khan. There's a lot of people, a lot of nobles and princesses and this and that prince. And so you might stumble upon things. And another intriguing question to wonder about is, what if Chinggis Khan was already found centuries ago? What if when the Mongol Empire collapsed and there was maybe lawlessness, what if kind of grave robbers and tomb raiders already found him? I wouldn't know, but you have to think some people would know that that's the area of the grave and of the graves of the Mongol royalty. So it may have already, some things may have already been looted, but there's always stuff they forget and leave behind. So
Okay, then what else would you add regarding the burial sites of Mongol rulers?
just that one of the great things that makes the desire and project of trying to find a Khan so intriguing is that the Mongols made such an effort to hide their Khans and protect them from future generations of tomb raiders and
Yeah,
now curious archaeologists and treasure hunters. They did their best to hide them, and often, Mongolia is a big empty plain in many places, and so it would be hard to find something like that. And yet, if you could find something like that, it's unbelievable to think what it would reveal about the Mongol Empire.
do you want to add something else, or we can stop here?
I've said my piece. I have nothing to add.
Yeah, we can stop here, and we're going to continue our talks in coming weeks. I'm very happy that you remain busy in 2024. I'm also both happy and concerned about being more engaged with all kinds of tasks, but knowing the circumstances, it's not a bad thing. Actually, it's always better to be very busy than idle. And
I can verify that.
yeah, exactly. I wish you all the best, and we'll talk very soon.
Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Bye bye.